The bell over the cafe door jingled like it always did, that soft sound that meant safety for so many. Grace Donnelly, hair pinned back, sleeves rolled neatly to her elbows, was already behind the counter, her hands moving with quiet precision. She wasn't the kind of woman people noticed first, but she was the kind they remembered. Her cafe, the Mason Mug, wasn't just a place for coffee. It was a refuge. A soft landing spot for tired souls in a small town just 15 minutes from Fort Granger, a Marine base that breathed discipline and sacrifice. Outside Mason, Georgia, looked like a postcard, oak-lined sidewalks, peeling paint on century-old storefronts, and flags fluttering proudly on porches. Inside Grace's cafe, though, the world slowed down. The coffee was simple. No caramel drizzle or artistic foam swirls. Just steaming mugs poured with care, served alongside warmth and silence. Grace believed silence was sacred, especially for the men and women who came through her door carrying invisible weight. Every Wednesday morning at 9 sharp was Heroes Hour. It started as 3 friends around a table. Ben Donnelly, her late husband's father, a Marine drill instructor whose voice once rattled recruits to their bones. Ralph, a Vietnam vet who barely spoke but never missed a week. And Louisa, an Army nurse whose laugh tinkled like wind chimes even when her eyes carried storms. Over the years, the circle grew. Iraq, Afghanistan, Desert Storm. Veterans from every era found their way to this little cafe, drawn more to Grace than to the coffee. She had a way of seeing people, not their medals or scars. Above the register hung a photo of her late husband, Staff Sergeant Michael Donnelly. Not in dress blues, but in jeans, boots kicked up, holding a steaming mug outside the cafe. It was taken 2 weeks before he left for Afghanistan. He never came home. Grace's grief didn't close her off. Instead, she poured it into this cafe, turning it into a sanctuary. That morning began like every other. The smell of dark roast filled the air, sunlight spilled across polished tables, and the familiar hum of conversation set the tone. Grace was setting out mugs for her regulars when Ray McMillan walked in with his black lab shepherd mix, Shadow. Ray was quiet, late 50s, an ex-Marine recon whose presence said more than words ever could. Shadow stayed close to his side, wearing a bright red vest, service dog. Do Not Pet Grace greeted him with her usual soft smile. Window seats open, Ray. He nodded, voice gravelly. Thanks. Then the atmosphere shifted. The door swung open, letting in a rush of cool air, and a man stepped inside like he owned the room. Crisp navy blazer, polished shoes, and a clipboard clutched like a sword. His name tag read, Logan Prescott, State Health Inspector. Grace straightened. She hadn't been expecting him. Can I help you find something? Inspection, he said flatly. Unannounced. Prescott moved through the cafe with clinical detachment, checking fridge temperatures, running fingers along counters, scribbling on his clipboard. He was halfway to the pastry case when his gaze landed on Shadow. He froze. That animal, he barked, pointing. This is a food establishment. Animals aren't permitted where food is served. Health violation. The cafe fell silent. Conversations cut off mid-sentence. Chairs stopped creaking. All eyes turned to Grace. She stepped out from behind the counter, steady but calm. He's a registered service dog. Federal law permits him here. Prescott's face hardened. I don't care what vest he's wearing. Dog shed. They carry saliva, dander. You want to keep this cafe open. The dog leaves. Now. Ray's knuckles whitened around his coffee cup, but he said nothing. Shadow stayed perfectly still, watching his owner. Grace took a breath and made a choice. I'm not asking a veteran to leave, she said softly but firmly. And I'm not asking his service dog to leave either. Write your report. But you'll write it knowing you tried to humiliate a man who served his country in front of the people he protected. A murmur rippled through the cafe. Someone muttered, damn right. But before anyone could speak further, the door opened again. Deborah Lyle entered, a woman in heels sharp enough to click like gunfire. Regional manager for Mason Mug's corporate parent. She froze mid-step, taking in the scene. Grace Donnelly, she said coldly. You just violated direct compliance policy in front of a state inspector. Pack your things. You're terminated." The words sliced through the cafe. Someone gasped. A spoon clattered to the floor. Grace didn't argue, didn't cry. She untied her apron with trembling hands, folded it neatly, and placed it on the counter. She glanced at Ray, at Shadow, then whispered to her barista, Lena, "Make sure Ray gets his refill." Without a word, she walked out into the bright Georgia morning. Behind her, the cafe stood frozen. But someone pulled out their phone and hit record. And in that moment, a quiet act of defiance was captured. A line drawn. Grace wasn't fired for breaking rules. She was fired for refusing to break her soul. Far away, in an office lined with marine photographs and brass plaques, Colonel Richard Gaines received a phone call he wouldn't ignore. The cafe was silent, but the storm was already rolling in. The Mason Mug Café sat in stunned silence. The chatter that had once filled the cozy space was gone, replaced by whispers and shifting chairs. Some customers left quietly, their half-finished coffee abandoned. Others stayed, their eyes fixed on the door like it might reopen and undo what had just happened. At the counter, Lena, Grace's young barista, kept her post. Her hands shook as she poured Ray's refill, but she refused to walk away. Later, she would admit, "If I'd left that station, I'd have let her down." Ray sat hunched in his corner. Shadow curled at his feet, the dog's ears twitching at every movement in the room. Ray's jaw was tight, his knuckles white against the ceramic mug. He'd been in firefights that were quieter than this. The front window rattled slightly in a passing breeze, but the sound that followed wasn't the wind. A low, distant rumble echoed through the streets of Mason. At first, it was faint, like a storm rolling over the Georgia hills. Glasses trembled on tables. Coffee rippled inside cups. A little boy near the pastry case looked at his mother, wide-eyed. "Mom, what's that sound?" Chairs scraped against the floor as customers stood and peered outside. The fog of a cool morning clung low to Main Street. And then, through the mist, headlights pierced the haze. Not one, not two. 4 military Humvees rolled down the street in a slow, deliberate procession. Tires groaned against pavement. Their engines growled like thunder. The vehicles stopped nose to tail in front of the cafe, boxing in the parking lot like an armored wall. Doors swung open in unison. Out stepped Colonel Richard Gaines, a man whose very posture carried decades of command. He wore full Marine Corps dress blues, his medals gleaming like captured sunlight, gold buttons polished, white gloves tucked under his arm. Behind him, 24 Marines emerged, their formation crisp, their faces unreadable. They lined the sidewalk like a silent honor guard. Inside, every soul in the Mason Mug froze. Inspector Prescott, still clutching his clipboard, went pale. Deborah Lyle took a small step back from the counter, her lips parting as if to speak, but no words came. The bell over the cafe door jingled once, soft and almost mocking in the silence, as Colonel Gaines stepped inside. His boots struck the floor like drumbeats. Slow, steady, each step echoed off the cafe walls. He stopped in the center of the room, scanning the faces around him. His eyes landed first on Lena, who swallowed hard, and then on Ray. Ray rose to his feet. The two men exchanged a look, a silent recognition forged from years of service. Ray gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. The colonel returned it with something deeper, a salute. Gasps rippled through the cafe. Prescott stammered, "I didn't know he was." The colonel turned his gaze on him, sharp but calm. "You don't need to know who someone is," he said, voice low but carrying weight, "to treat them with dignity." The inspector's mouth closed. His clipboard dropped to his side. Colonel Gaines turned to Lena next. "Is Grace Donnelly here?" Lena's voice cracked. "No, sir." She was fired. For standing up for Mr. McMillan and Shadow. A muscle in Gaines' jaw twitched. His voice hardened. "That woman has done more for the families of this base than most agencies combined. She gave my men a place to breathe when they came home with no words. And she treated a decorated Marine with the respect this nation promised him. And forgot." For the first time, Ray spoke. His voice was gravel, steady but heavy with emotion. "She didn't ask questions," he said quietly. "She didn't flinch when I walked in with a dog. She just poured the coffee and gave me a place to sit. That was the first time in a long time I felt like a person again." A tear slipped down a woman's cheek near the register. Someone sniffled quietly in the back. Colonel Gaines nodded slowly, then turned toward the Marines outside. He stepped to the door, raised his hand, and gave a single, sharp signal. The Marines filed in. Silent, precise, reverent. 2 Marines moved behind the counter and carefully removed the Mason Mugg's corporate logo from the wall, folding the vinyl panel like a flag. Another carried in a hand-painted wooden sign and hung it where the chalkboard once stood. In bold white letters, it read. Deborah Lyle tried to speak, but Colonel Gaines' gaze stopped her cold. "You've made your decision," he said firmly. "Now we'll make ours." He stepped outside, pulling a phone from his pocket. Moments later, Lena's phone buzzed. Her eyes widened as she read aloud. "Fort Granger requests Grace Donnelly report to base headquarters. Today." Ray exhaled, shadow rising to his feet beside him. The cafe buzzed with whispers, awe, and disbelief. A reckoning had begun. Grace had no idea what was coming next, but the world was already moving in her favor. Grace sat in her truck at the edge of her driveway, hands gripping the steering wheel, the engine still off. The cafe's smell of coffee and cinnamon still clung to her clothes, though now it felt like a memory rather than a comfort. She'd been sitting there for 15 minutes, staring at the quiet road ahead. The text message on her phone glowed softly in her lap. Fort Granger requests Grace Donnelly report to base headquarters. Today. She didn't know what to expect. Was this trouble? A lecture? An apology? Her chest tightened, but somewhere beneath the fear, she felt it. Something had shifted. Grace turned the key. The truck rumbled to life, and she pulled onto the familiar road she'd driven hundreds of times before, though never like this. Fort Granger rose out of the Georgia pines like a small city. Chain-link fences topped with razor wire, guard towers standing watch, and American flags lining the entrance road like sentinels. The faint sound of cadence calls echoed in the distance, deep voices chanting in unison, boots striking pavement like thunder. Grace slowed at the checkpoint, rolling down her window. "Name," the guard asked, his posture rigid but polite. "Grace Donnelly. I was asked to come." The guard checked his clipboard, then his demeanor softened. "Yes, ma'am. Drive straight to Administration Building B. Colonel Gaines is expecting you." Grace's breath caught. The colonel. The main administration building was immaculate, every brick perfectly aligned, every flag perfectly folded. Grace parked in a visitor's spot and stepped out, her shoes crunching against the gravel. She felt out of place, like she'd wandered into someone else's world, a world she used to belong to long ago, as a military wife. Now, she was an outsider. She smoothed her flannel shirt and brushed her hands over her jeans, suddenly self-conscious about the coffee stains. The glass doors slid open with a quiet hiss, and there he was. Even out of dress blues, he carried himself with the same authority, a calm presence wrapped in khaki fatigues. He extended his hand, his expression warm but unreadable. "Grace," he said simply. "Thank you for coming." She shook his hand, firm but cautious. "Still not sure why I'm here," she admitted. "Let me show you something." They walked down a long hallway lined with portraits of past commanders and plaques commemorating decades of service. Grace glanced at each one, feeling the weight of history pressing in around her. The colonel stopped in front of a door, labeled. Inside was a room that felt unfinished. Folding chairs stacked against the wall, whiteboards scrawled with half-erased plans, unopened boxes marked therapy supplies, donations, equipment. A few young staffers moved quietly in the background, arranging mats, testing lights, organizing binders. Colonel Gaines stood in the middle of the room, hands clasped behind his back. "This is a pilot program," he said. "We've been trying to get it off the ground for 2 years. Problem is, we can't seem to make it stick. Paperwork doesn't heal people. Policies don't rebuild trust." Grace folded her arms. "And what does?" He turned to her, eyes steady. You tell me. You built a space that men and women with invisible wounds came to. You made them feel human again. And you did it without a single government grant or counseling degree. Grace blinked. Colonel, I'm not a therapist. I don't have training. I run a coffee shop. You ran a sanctuary, he corrected gently. You did more with coffee and kindness than some programs do with $1 million budget. Grace opened her mouth to respond, but a soft voice interrupted. Is that her? A young woman stepped out from a back room. Her arms and jaw bore the faint traces of burn scars, partly hidden under long sleeves. She moved cautiously, a golden retriever puppy padding beside her with a vest that read in training. Her name tag read Tiffany Rios. I just want to say, Tiffany said softly, I saw the video of you and the dog and the guy. I haven't been able to sit in a cafe since I came home, but I think I could sit in a place you run. Grace's throat tightened. Tiffany knelt beside her puppy, stroking his fur. The colonel gave Grace a small smile. We'd like to offer you a position, he said. Not as a figurehead. Not for a photo op. As the director of this center. Grace blinked, stunned. You're serious. As a heart attack. You'd run the programs. Build the culture. Shape the space. He gestured around the room. You already know what works. Community, routine, respect. Grace looked down at Tiffany, who was tracing a finger along her puppy's ear. Then her mind flashed to Ray and Shadow, Ralph and Louisa, the dozens of veterans who'd found their way to her cafe not for fancy drinks, but for peace. The answer settled in her chest like it had been waiting all along. I'll do it, she whispered. The colonel nodded once, his expression softening. Then let's get to work. That night, Grace returned to the empty building. The walls were bare, the air smelled faintly of paint and cardboard, but it felt alive already, like a seed just planted. She reached into her bag and pulled out a photo. Michael, sitting outside the cafe, boots up, laughing, sunlight catching his smile. She pinned it to the wall, unframed, unpolished. Just memory, just mission. A quiet promise filled the room. This wasn't just a program. It was a home. Word of Grace's new role spread faster than she imagined. But with attention came scrutiny and challenges she didn't see coming. By the end of the week, Mason, Georgia was buzzing. The local paper ran a full-page headline. From Café to Command, Grace Donnelly steps up for veterans. Her phone buzzed nonstop with messages. Some were from grateful families. Others were from strangers who'd seen the viral video and wanted to donate. But Grace didn't feel like a hero. The first time she unlocked the doors to the Veteran Transition and Wellness Center, she stood in silence, taking it all in. The building wasn't much to look at yet, bare walls, mismatched furniture, the faint scent of paint and disinfectant. Still, it carried weight. It felt like something sacred was about to grow here. Grace hung a simple sign above the door. You're home. Sit. Breathe. The early days were slow. Some afternoons passed with only a handful of veterans trickling in, their eyes wary, their steps hesitant. Grace didn't push them. She didn't greet them with therapy forms or clipboards. She just smiled, offered coffee, and let them sit. She added small touches to make the space feel less like an institution and more like a living room. A soft rug under the main table. A bookshelf filled with donated novels and military biographies. A whiteboard by the coffee pot where people could write, need a ride? Need a listener. It started to work. Ray McMillan showed up the first week. Shadow trotted straight to a sunny corner and laid down like he'd claimed it. Tiffany Rios began coming every Tuesday, always in long sleeves, always quiet. She didn't speak in group sessions, but she started sketching again, her drawings pinned to the walls. Images of homecomings, hands clasped, service dogs curled at veterans' feet. And Lena, the young barista from the Mason Mug, visited every Friday. She brought fresh pastries and her signature laugh. You're supposed to be some big shot now, she teased, sliding a mug of coffee toward Grace. I'm just trying not to mess this up, Grace replied, smiling softly. But success brought scrutiny. 2 weeks after opening, a team of government auditors arrived. They wore stiff suits, carried clipboards, and walked through the center like they were inspecting a battlefield. One of them, a man with sharp glasses and an expression that never softened, cornered Grace near the office. "What certifications do you hold that qualify you to counsel veterans?" he asked. His tone was clinical, almost dismissive. Grace didn't blink. "I don't have certifications," she said softly. "Just consistency and kindness." The inspector scribbled notes, but said nothing. When they left, Grace's hands trembled slightly as she poured herself coffee. Colonel Gaines stepped up behind her, his presence calm but reassuring. "They're not here to shut you down," he said. "Doesn't feel that way," Grace muttered. He smiled faintly. "Good. That means you're making waves." A week later, a letter arrived. The center was being reviewed as a potential national model. Colonel Gaines called it a victory. Grace just felt humbled. Despite the attention, Grace never changed her approach. She stayed hands-on, memorizing names, listening more than she spoke, and creating space for silence when needed. Some days were heavy. A Marine in his 20s sat in the corner for 3 hours, staring at nothing. Grace didn't push him to talk. She simply refilled his coffee, left a notepad and pen at his table, and gave him a soft smile. The next day, he returned with a drawing of his squamates, every single face rendered in detail, tears staining the edges of the paper. Other days were joyful. Tiffany finally laughed during a group art session. Lena painted a mural in the hallway, filling it with swirling blues and golds, dogs curled at boots, a coffee cup steaming like a beacon. And some days were just quiet. Grace liked those days too. But the Mason mug tugged at her heart. One rainy afternoon, she slipped in unannounced. The cafe smelled the same, warm and familiar. Photos lined the walls now, portraits of veterans and their service dogs, handwritten notes from families thanking the cafe for being their safe place. Above the register, a new sign had been hung. Grace's Corner, where no one sits alone. Lena spotted her and grinned. "You're famous, you know." "I'm just here for a cup of coffee," Grace said softly. They sat together at the counter, sipping quietly. Grace traced the rim of her mug, feeling something she couldn't quite name. The cafe wasn't hers anymore, but in a way it always would be. That evening, Grace spoke at a small community fundraiser for veteran families. No teleprompters, no script, just her voice. "I didn't set out to build a program," she said, standing before a modest crowd of parents, grandparents, and kids holding crayon posters. "I just refused to throw out a man and his dog. That's it." The room fell silent. Then applause erupted, loud, raw, heartfelt. In the back, Ray stood, his silver star pinned to his chest, and gave her a quiet salute. Grace's throat tightened. She nodded back, a silent promise passing between them. Back at the center that night, she added a new photo to the growing wall of memories. This one showed the cafe the day after the Humvees arrived, people shoulder to shoulder, dogs under tables. Every face lit with something powerful, belonging. Beneath it, she pinned a simple card. "Legacy isn't what we build for ourselves. It's what we protect in others." And for the first time in a long time, Grace felt peace. 3 weeks later, a letter with a gold seal would arrive, one that would change everything again. The envelope arrived on a quiet Tuesday morning. It was thick, official, with the gold seal of the Department of Defense stamped across the front. Colonel Gaines himself delivered it, standing tall in her office doorway. "You'll want to sit for this," he said. Grace frowned, pulling out a chair. Her hands trembled as she broke the seal. The words blurred for a moment as her eyes scanned the first line. "You are hereby nominated for the National Civilian Commendation for Distinguished Service to Veterans." Grace blinked, reading it again. And again. I didn't do anything special," she whispered. Gaines chuckled softly, his voice low but steady. "That's exactly why you're getting it." The letter came with an invitation, one that made Grace's heart pound. She wasn't just being recognized. She was being asked to speak at the National Veterans Advocacy Conference in Washington, D.C. "I'm not a public speaker," she told Gaines, panic rising in her voice. He smiled. "You are now." The day she left for Washington, Grace packed light, One blazer, her husband Michael's old watch, and the battered notebook she'd used behind the cafe counter for years. Inside, she'd scribbled birthdays, service anniversaries, and private notes. Tiffany prefers tea. Don't ask Ray about May 15th. That notebook carried more weight than any resume she could ever write. At the airport, she heard a voice behind her. "Need a ride, Miss Donnelly?" She turned to see Ray McMillan, standing straight and proud in his full dress blues. Shadow sat calmly at his side, tail wagging once. "The base assigned me as your escort," Ray said with a small grin. Grace laughed softly, half nerves, half awe. "You clean up pretty good, Ray." He smirked. "You're the one about to speak to the Pentagon." The ballroom was larger than Grace imagined. White tablecloths, brass podiums, cameras at every angle. The lights glinted off medals and ribbons that lined the crowd. When her name appeared on the massive screen in elegant lettering, Grace's knees almost buckled. She walked to the podium, heart pounding, notebook clutched in her hand. Her voice was soft at first, almost too small for the cavernous room. "I'm not a general," she began. "I'm not a doctor. I didn't write policy. I managed a cafe near a military base." A pause. The crowd leaned in. "I serve coffee." I listened. Murmurs rippled through the audience. "In that space," she continued, "I saw something sacred happen. Veterans came not for advice, but for presence. They didn't need to be fixed. They needed to be seen." A few people wiped at their eyes. "One day, I got fired for letting a man sit with his service dog. That was the moment everything changed." But the truth is, it was never about coffee. It was about dignity. The applause began softly, then grew louder, stronger, until it thundered through the hall. Grace swallowed hard. At the back of the room, Ray stood motionless, giving her a solemn nod, like a soldier receiving his orders, loud and clear. That evening, Grace stepped outside alone, away from the cameras and chatter. The air in D.C. was cool, the sun dipping behind the Potomac. "Miss Donnelly?" She turned to see an older man in a gray suit, white beard, and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He held an old photograph, its edges frayed from years of being carried. "You don't remember me, do you?" he said softly. Grace studied his face, her heart tugging at something familiar. He held up the photo. It was of him, decades younger, sitting outside the Mason Mug Café, Michael beside him, both laughing, coffee cups in hand. "You poured me a cup of coffee the day I got my medical discharge," the man said, his voice breaking slightly. "You didn't say a word. You just smiled. That was the first time. I felt like myself again." Grace's breath hitched. Tears stung her eyes. He pressed the photo into her hands. "It's yours now." She took it carefully, her fingers trembling, and for a moment the noise of Washington faded. When Grace returned home to Mason, the town gathered for a welcome celebration. Flags lined the streets. Children waved handmade posters. But Grace didn't head straight there. Instead, she drove to the wellness center. It was late, the building quiet except for a few veterans gathered near the outdoor fire pit. Grace slipped inside, heading for the wall of photos. She pinned 2 new pictures side by side. A snapshot of the conference crowd, standing in ovation. The old cafe photo, Michael's smile bright, the young soldier at his side. Beneath them, she taped a small card. "Honor grows where kindness is consistent." As she turned to leave, the front door creaked open. A young man, barely 20, stood there, eyes darting nervously. Is this the place for, people like us?" Grace smiled gently, her voice soft but sure. "No, son. This is the place for people like all of us." The young man exhaled, shoulders easing as he stepped inside. Grace watched him take a seat, her heart swelling. Her circle wasn't just full anymore. It was open. In a world that moved faster every day, Grace Donnelly had built something rare. She didn't wear a uniform. She didn't hold rank. But she upheld something sacred, dignity. And in doing so, she reminded us all that heroes aren't always loud. Sometimes they're women behind cafe counters, pouring coffee with trembling hands, refusing to bend when it matters most. Grace's story may seem like a rare one, but maybe it shouldn't be. How many graces do we pass by without noticing? How many veterans have we thanked with words, but not actions? Would you have stood up like she did? Have you ever witnessed a quiet act of courage? Or been changed by someone's unexpected kindness? Share your story in the comments. You never know who might need to hear it.